Okay, so what we want to do in this video is continue on with what we were talking about the non-price determinants of demand. And what we're talking about in this video is the size of the market. Okay, so obviously we're still talking about demand because I've just said it, and we're going to go through now the non-price determinants of demand. These are the things that cause a shift either outwards or inwards of the demand curve. So the ones that we've already covered in this series thus far are tastes of the consumer. Okay, so if a consumer increases their desires, or if consumers in general increase their desires for a certain good, there will be an outward shift in the demand curve. We have the price of other related goods. So if the price of substitutes changes or the price of complements changes, then what this will cause is either an inward or outward shift of the demand curve. We have expectations of consumers about future price changes. So if consumers expect the future price of the good to either increase or decrease, this will cause a shift in the demand curve. We've talked about income of the consumer, whether it's a normal or inferior good change. If the income changes and the good is either normal good or inferior good. And now what we're going to do is talk about the size of the market. Before we do that, as always, going to remind ourselves what a shift of the demand curve is. So an outward shift just means the entire demand curve moves or shifts to the right, and that means that at every price more is bought, and this is called an increase in demand. On the other hand, an inward shift of the demand curve from right to left is called a decrease in demand, and the reason for that is because at every price less is bought. Now, when we're talking about the size of the market, right, what we actually mean is the quantity of buyers and sellers, or the ability of buyers and sellers to buy that operate in whatever that market is. However, what I'm saying here, just before we do that, we look at like the amount of buyers and sellers there, okay? So however you want to, judge the size of a market, it certainly looks plenty big anyway, okay? But if you look at an international market, like stocks and shares, things like that, it's tiny, okay? So, but yes, it is buyers and sellers, because that's what a market is, a collection of buyers and sellers. However, now we're only talking about consumers, okay? So the demanders, the customers, the buyers side of the market. So just think about this for a second. I hope it's relatively obvious to you why this may be true. The greater the number of consumers in a market, the greater the level of demand. Okay, so if there's lots of people in a market, you would imagine that lots of things are being bought ceteris paribus. So the lower the number of consumers in a market, the lower the level of demand. If there's very few people buying or seeking to buy in a market, well then ceteris paribus, the less that will be bought. Now that's not what economics is about. Economics is essentially about measuring the change in one thing and how it affects the change in something else. So what I've said, if there's a lot or less, or like if there's a lot or little, but what we're saying is, therefore, if the number of consumers increases, that will increase. So if the number of consumers increases, that's a change in the number of consumers, the number of demanders, the demand side of the market. If the number of consumers increases, well, that's going to increase the amount that is bought ceteris paribus, and as such cause an outward shift in the demand curve. On the other hand, if the number of consumers decreases, that's the change in consumers, how does that affect the change in demand? Well, that means that less will be bought, and as such that would reflect itself as an inward shift of the demand curve. So all we're saying here is increase in market size. What I mean by that is that in this case, there are more buyers. If through, let's say, immigration or whatever, the population increases, there are more buyers. Therefore, the entire demand curve will shift out for whatever market this may be. Now, that means that's an increase in demand, and that means that at every price, more is bought. Now, again, I'm only showing this at price P1, but at every price along here, we would expect to see, well, we would see, assuming an outward shift in the demand curve, that more is purchased. Okay, and then the next thing is a decrease in the size of the market. Well, if people leave through emigration, that means that there'll be less people in the country on net, and as such the demand curve will shift in for whatever particular market we are talking about. Therefore, at every price less is bought, again I'm only showing at a price P1, but at every price less is purchased from this market, this is a decrease in demand, not a decrease in quantity demanded, because this is a non-price determinant, it is a shift. And that is everything that is to do with number of consumers in the market, the size of the market, the size of the buyers, or the demand side of the market.